wedi Gethin Davies. My name's Gethin Davies. A fi diwch rheolwr y prosiect Coedwigoedd Glaw Celtaidd. I'm the Senior Project Manager for the Celtic Rainforests Wales project. Very lucky to have that role. As a slideshow. Thank you. Let's just give you a very, very quick background and information on the project prior to handing over to Hilary. So of course the project ydy €9 miliwn a hanner euro, neu €7 miliwn a hanner o bunno. It's a €9.5 million project, or £7.5 million project, primarily funded by the European Commission via the Life, Nature and Biodiversity Programme, who cover 60% of the cost. So mae Comisiwn Ewropeaidd yn ariannu 60% o'r prosiect trwy rhaglen natur a bioamrywiaeth Life. Other contributors include Welsh Government, who give 2 million, Llywodraeth Cymru roi 2 million, and then the other financial backers are listed along the bottom. So Disgrifiad National Park Authority, RSPB Cymru, Coedwigoedd Woodland Trust, NRW, and Dŵr Cymru, Welsh Water. So that makes up the partnership. Ar y prosiect cychwyn yn swyddogol ar y gyntaf Awst 2018, a bydd y rhedag tan mis Gorffennaf 2025. The project officially started on 1st of August 2018 and will run at present until July 2025. The overall objective, it's a massive project, lots of sub-projects within it, but the overall objective is the overarching aim, prif amcan, di gwella statws cadwraeth, cadwraethol cynefinoedd, 9.1 a dim, so Coedwigoedd Saesneg, Gorllewin Prydain, a 9.8 dim, tilio Ysterion Forest, y slopes, greens and ravines, a hynny ar draws 5 ardal cadwraeth arbennig yn Nghymru, trwy fynd i'r afal a rhai o'r prif datrysiadau i'r cynefinoedd hynny. So the overarching aim to improve the conservation status of 2 European protected habitat types, 91A0, so they're the sort of Atlantic oak woods, the western Pacific oak woodlands that we get along the western sea border of the UK, and 91A0, the small leaf line, ash dominated Hilary forest, slopes, trees and ravines. That's across 5 special areas of conservation in Wales, and through the project we'll be going about tackling some of the main identified threats to those habitats. And that of course includes grazing, often lack of, so I'm going to pass you over to Hilary now, who will be able to tell you a lot more about that. Diolch.
Diolch, Gethin. So I'm Hilary Kehoe. I work for Pont, Wales's grazing organisation, helping to use grazing livestock to graze for habitat benefit across Wales. I farm with my family near Bethesda, grazing various habitats with our cattle, sheep and ponies. And I'm delivering 2 grazing related webinars for the Celtic Rainforest Life project for Snowdonia National Park, and helping to produce some resources on woodland grazing. In last week's webinar, we asked why the Celtic rainforest needed managed grazing, and we covered the unique species of lichens, mosses and ferns found in them. Seem to have a slide missing here. The bats, birds and other wildlife that they support. We looked at what livestock can achieve and the threats and problems from invasive species, unchecked regeneration, rampant undergrowth and unmanaged grazing currently faced in some of the Celtic rainforests. The vision for the future, restoring the conditions needed for the plants and wildlife, was outlined. We looked at the timescale we need to think in for rainforest management, centuries rather than years. There were some decision trees to help determine appropriate management and the grazing considerations to think about before introducing livestock to the woodlands. So we're going to carry on from there and start looking at the challenges we may encounter. So talk outline is a quick recap, looking at the challenges and solutions to establishing grazing in the woodlands, the benefits to livestock of grazing there, return back to the flow charts and the decision trees that we had last week, look at how monitoring is progressing and sort of suggestions for monitoring systems, and then there'll be time for questions and answers. So after last week's talk, inspired by the benefits of livestock in the Celtic rainforests for plants, wildlife, access and farming, you've decided to start grazing your woodland. This slightly wordy table is worth a minute for you to just read through yourself. I don't think I need to sort of read all the squares for you, but I'll leave you for a minute. It sort of explains, it illustrates how low to moderate grazing is likely to produce woods of the highest conservation interest. You can see at the bottom end, with no grazing, you get one sort of level of population of plant-eating insects and birds that like to use dense shrub layers, and a few species of small mammals, a bit less diversity in higher and lower plants, and no real regeneration of trees and shrubs because of the dense competition. And at the other end of the scale, with too much grazing, you end up with parkland or moorland and impoverishment due to net loss of nutrients from the system, an increase in epiphytic lichens associated with parklands, loss of diversity and abundance of small mammals and species of open ground instead of woodland species, a reduction in raptors that eat small mammals, and an increase in parkland and moorland species. So the green area in the middle sort of is the sweet spot that we're trying to aim for. So high densities of livestock used for short periods will affect rapid change in the woodland, opening rank stands or browsing unwanted scrub. But this speed of change is likely to be harmful to the associated fauna, potentially causing compaction and damage to vegetation structure that can take years to reverse. Lower densities of stock allow enough forage for animals to be selective, and change is more gradual, and time can be taken to evaluate the effect of grazing. In general, it's better to have a gentle start in terms of stocking levels, unless you want to mob stock a specific area to reduce to clear holly regen or bramble, in which case maybe you just fence stock into that particular area for a very brief length of time and see how it goes. In terms of livestock, finding the right livestock for your woodland helps to have a quick look at how the different animals would use it. So cattle have got, this one's showing her very nice long tongue, which they use to sort of wrap around vegetation and pull into their mouths. They're heavy animals, so when they're passing through bracken and bramble and things, then they can trample it down and reduce its density and vigour. Although they can also, if it's very wet and muddy, obviously cause a bit too much poaching. They quite like to browse, particularly native and traditional species breeds, and they'll enjoy pulling away at the branches and sort of helping to make clear vegetation for the air to pass through in the woodland. They're liable to sort of a lot more regulations in their management, which we'll go into in a bit, so they can be slightly off-putting in that respect. Ponies will browse as well. You can see that they've got a very fine set of teeth, top and bottom, whereas cattle only have teeth in the bottom. So they'll nibble grass really close to the ground, down to like a centimetre, but they will also, they're quite tall, so they can browse the trees. They're equally heavy or nearly as heavy as some cattle. And so they'll have the same effect on trampling bracken down. And they're particularly good when you put them into a new site at making routes around and finding how to travel around the site. So they can be really useful to put in first and get people used to having a grazing animal in the site before introducing cattle, which might have be more commercially attractive to a grazier. Sheep have a place, being used maybe for close shepherding in woodland glades, which we do a bit of with our family, using Hebridean or Manx sheep, which are very good at flocking, so they're great to take out with a shepherd. And sheep can do a good job over the winter in a wood. They won't trample the ground and upset the bluebells. But if it's full of brambles and they're very woolly, then they can end up getting stuck, and you have to be very careful going all the way through the wood to make sure you've got all your sheep. They're more vulnerable around dogs. Even our close shepherded sheep have been, I think last year, somebody came out with 5 dogs and they just ploughed into the middle of the sheep, and one ran into a bush and it took us a day to find it. So that's a worry. But their lightness and their ability to graze down the woodland floor is very useful. Native and rare breeds are they've got a wider palette, so they're more likely to browse than, say, a Suffolk, something like a Hebridean or a Manx. So you can see these Hebridean lambs really enjoying the gorse blossom off the gorse bushes. In the summer, sheep suffer from maggots, which you need to be very careful of if it's hard to see them all in the woodland. Oops. Pigs can manage woodland very well under certain situations. They can easily be used to clear the brash and undergrowth of woodland to help regenerate saplings and woodland pasture and small herbaceous plants. But their role is mainly as a scarifying tool. They can't be maintained in woodlands all year round because they're great at just ploughing up. You can see that one's been digging big holes with her nose. They've also been used for the removal of invasive rhododendrons in Scotland. And that sort of saves on pesticide and machinery in a woodland, say on a very steep slope where it's hard to get machinery. The correct breed's a key factor using pigs. Woodland pigs have got to be hardy, good at foraging, and have some resistance to sunburn. They'll be outside for long periods when the weather may be harsh, especially in the winter months. So the desirable traits we need are more associated with the traditional breeds like the Tamworth, the Berkshire, the British Saddleback, the Duroc, the Gloucester Old Spot, and the Welsh. Pigs have got to have shelter in their foraging area, which could be improvised or posh pig arks. And there's no definite recommendations for stocking rates, as it obviously depends on the management objective. But the minimum is 2 animals, as pigs are very social. So they need to be kept in family groups or in social groups. You have to use pigs in sensitive management of woodland. They can be really destructive, especially big pigs, which can destroy the ground flora and shrubs and even mature trees if they're left in the same area for too long. And they can also dig up archaeological remains. But keeping a few pigs and moving them regularly can be really effective at controlling bramble and bracken in woodland, although it's not commercially sound to produce pig meat because their level of intake isn't enough to sort of fatten them up. Most people end up supplementary feeding them to some extent if they've got them in the woods. There's probably enough feral goats around the Celtic rainforests, so we don't really need to introduce them, but they're good browsers. As you can see, these have achieved complete coverage of this tree, and they're very agile. Sorry. So how to find animals? When you're looking for animals for grazing your sites, there's several options you can try. It's good to start locally and see who the neighbours are, because it makes transporting animals to the site easier, and extra grazing may be attractive to a neighbour. So it's worth asking around and then arranging to visit the farm and chat to the farmer about his system and whether they've got any animals suitable for grazing your site. Or if they haven't, maybe they know someone who has got the right sort of stock. The Farmers Union of Wales or the National Farmers Union area secretaries are worth contacting, as they've got a detailed knowledge of local farmers and their activities. Breed societies of livestock that you think would be suitable for your land are worth contacting. So if it was cattle, you might be interested in Dexters or Highlands or Belties or Welsh Blacks or Shorthorns or sort of one of the more hardy traditional breeds. So if you contact the Breed Society, then they may well be able to put you in touch with a local smallholder or farmer with appropriate stock, or invite you to speak at a local meeting and discuss management of the land with the group. Smallholders groups are another option. They've often got members who are keen to graze other land and have rare or traditional breeds of livestock. If you've got funding, livestock leasing is a good way to encourage a farmer to get started with a conservation grazing herd. So they may have stock that aren't right for your woodland, but be prepared to increase their herd. And if you can buy a few cattle with your project money and hand them over to the grazier for 3 to 5 years with an agreement, and agree that he will replace the same age structure at the end of the period, So you give him a two 2-year-olds and a 4-year-old, then at the end of 5 years, he gives you back 2 2-year-olds and a 4-year-old. They won't be the same cattle. And he gets to keep surplus stock and sell off bullocks and things. So he starts to maybe derive some income from it. It's a really good confidence builder for farmers who aren't maybe sure whether the conservation thing works for them. So in Pont, we have, I think, 6 livestock leasing agreements. And this herd of South Devons on near Bridgend, I've forgotten the name of the common now, but they're on a common near Bridgend, and he's now got 30 red Devons because he's just increased the herd and he's finding it's working really well. So farmers and pony owners are often willing to graze land away from the farm so they can harvest crops and concentrate on management of animals that need more attention on the farm. But for animal management and health and safety, there are items of infrastructure that you need to make grazing possible on sites. Sorry. So initially, fencing, it's got to be secure and suitable for the livestock to be contained. Lots of horse and pony owners aren't keen on using barbed wire and fences, and certainly the bottom strand of the fence shouldn't be barbed wire, as this can get caught on the pony's feet. The top strand can stop ponies from leaning over a fence and pushing it over. It's always worth walking a site with a potential grazier to assess the fencing and listen to their appraisal. There's no point having a beautiful fence with a gap at one end or a weak point that will always be found by the livestock. I find when you put cattle on a site, they'll sort of beat the bounds initially and go and have a look and see exactly where they could wriggle through. So it's almost worth putting them on a site and hanging back and watching them to make sure that you haven't missed a place they can get through. Poor fencing can teach animals to test boundaries and escape. And if they learn to test fences and are able to get out, they'll develop a habit of wandering, which has happened to me with some of my Highland cattle. Using brash as a deterrent, dead hedging won't work on most traditional breeds as they think that's lunch and they just walk through. Ponies are a bit easier to fence in, but more likely to panic if they get caught in loose wire, which can easily lead to injury. So fences have to be maintained in good condition. Cattle, sheep and pigs and ponies will be retained by a pig net fence with a single strand of high tensile wire underneath the netting, 2 strands of barbed wire over it. And the fence should have a top height of at least 1.1 metres. And high tensile wire can also be appropriate. It's easier for wildlife to cross having a 5-strand high tensile fence, and because you've got to be really careful not to injure or prevent wildlife using its roots. Quite often in a nature conservation situation, you'll see that the wire netting's been put on upside down, and that facilitates things wriggling through the bottom of the fence. So it isn't a mistake from the contractor, it's actually planned. So gates, it's good if you've got pedestrian gates around a site to make sure that they're actually kissing gates, because it's all too easy for somebody coming through not to realise there's stock on the site and to leave the gate open, and it will soon be found. Grids can be useful to put on roads so that animals can't get onto the main road off the track. It's a good deterrent. And water is really important, which we'll talk about in a minute. Handling and loading facilities are vital for getting animals on and off the site or dealing with vets. I'll go into those in a minute. And then they need shelter, which can be natural shelter. It could be undulations in the ground or hedges and walls that they can shade under. They need shelter from wind and rain and from hot sun. And they need somewhere to lie up. So it's all very well fencing around a fen, but you need to have the fence set back a little bit so that the animals have got a flat area that they can spread out and lie down and chew the cud. People are killed every year when they're handling cattle, either by an irate cow when they're ear tagging a calf in the field, or through crushing or goring when they're handling them. But well-designed and constructed handling pens make handling the animals a lot safer. If you look online looking for inspiration, the Grazing Advice Partnership information sheets and companies such as IAE or Bateman will come out and visit your site and draw up plans for handling pens. And they'll consider the size and temperament of the animals and what pens will be used for their design. They need to be located where there's access for a livestock trailer, so that you can go up with a trailer, turn around and drive off with your livestock loaded, and where animals can easily be driven to. So use the layout of existing fences and the topography of the site in the planning process. Animals prefer to run uphill and towards the light, so a pen in a dark hollow would be really hard to entice them into. If you can't get a vehicle to the woodland access, you may have to rethink the grazing animal. Halter-trained ponies or cattle that can safely be walked to site. But you also need to think about access for collection of casualty stock if access is difficult. So this is a pretty good pen system. It's got a gate in the middle, so you can put the animals in one end, reverse your trailer up to an open gate at the other end, and then push them through the middle gate and shut that behind them, and then load them quite easily. If you just have a single pen, that can cause problems, because you have to sort of open it, wave at the animals to keep them back, and then back the trailer in. So a system like this costs about £5,500–6,000 £6,000. And we've made very simple pens for our livestock and Anglesey for about 1,500 without a cattle crush. You'd have to add about another 1,000 or so to 1,800 for the crush. For ponies, you need solid-sided pens, because they can get their feet stuck between the rails. Motorway barriers work well, but they don't look great. So you can use water to manage areas for grazing, because livestock will only wander a certain distance from drinking water. An absolute maximum travelling distance of sort of 1 to 1.5 kilometres is suggested, but shorter distances are desirable. So if you move the water source, you can encourage them to graze different areas. Obviously, you have to think about poaching occurring around water troughs. So the location of the trough and maybe surfacing around the trough needs to be thought about. Even if there is natural water, it can be worth putting a trough on the site to stop the animals polluting a stream by standing around in it and dunging. And there's also the thought of a stream passing through fields with one herd of cattle in that aren't related to the cattle lower downstream, so they could pick up diseases from the ones further up river. You can use IBCs, the fruit juice tanks, and fill them with a bowser on a site if you haven't got running water. And then this pasture pump, the green thing, is installed in one of the Celtic Rainforests, and cattle, and I think ponies, can push the silver thing at the top, the bar, and that pumps water into the trough. So they soon very quickly learn to pump that and get themselves a drink, but sheep can't do that. So sheep will drink maybe 2 to 4 litres a day, or an adult sheep will drink 4 to 6.5, but they can quite often get enough water out of the grass and the vegetation that they're eating. Cattle drink 50 to 60 litres a day, so you really need to think about water provision. And you need enough so that if there's a group of cattle, the trough will fill fast enough so that the last ones have got enough to drink by the time the ones who have drunk first are wandering off. Horses will drink 30 to 40 litres of water a day. Obviously, the salinity and cleanliness and pH of the water are important. Sheep will refuse to drink from a trough with a thin layer of dust on the surface. Algal blooms can be toxic and cause problems in the summer. So it's always sensible to test the water on the site and ensure it's suitable before introducing livestock, and carry out regular checks of the water supply, because troughs can run dry or ballcocks can break. So it's good to check those when you're visiting your livestock. So we're thinking about when to graze. So in a woodland, if you graze it in the spring, you get good control of regrowth, because the plants are tasty and the livestock will eat them. Whereas in the autumn, they'll actually encourage regeneration by trampling seeds into the soil. So that's time of year, I suppose, as well. And then species of livestock, we've had a chat about that, the selection of cattle, sheep, ponies, goats, llamas maybe, pigs. And the class is whether they're young stock or dry cows or freshly calved cows or older ponies. Young stock on their own won't eat such a wide variety of vegetation as young stock with an older matriarch, because the older animal will teach them what's tasty. So it's quite good to sort of keep an older animal that knows the site when you introduce a few young ones, and then gradually, as they've learnt their way around, then you can remove the old one. The number of animals, we talked about that in the woodland. They're very, very sensitive to having too many animals at a time. It's a lot better to just introduce a few, see how it's going, then add if you need to add, because it takes a lot longer to rectify damage once it's done than it does to just quietly introduce another animal. So that is stocking rate as well, and density. So you could have some animals fenced into an area to clear holly or bramble in very dense numbers, although your stocking rate for the entire woodland may not be all that high. And then how long you leave them in there. So if you're managing semi-feral ponies in a woodland, it's sort of easier for whoever's managing them to leave them in long term, because then you need to work out where they're going to go when they're not in your wood. Things like cattle and sheep are sort of part of an agricultural system, and it's easier for the grazier to remove them and take them somewhere and carve them or bull them or whatever. It sort of fits into the farming system easier than a pony. Obviously, you've really got to think about the welfare of the animals. Have they got enough forage, enough water? Can they access shelter? Are they stressed by something? You need to make sure that they've got escape routes to get away from anything that might stress them, like dogs in the wood. So we're on dogs and their owners. I don't know who's listening, who's got a dog, or who has problems with dogs on site. We've got to find the right balance between encouraging access to experienced woodland and continuing to protect such an important habitat. And dog walking is one area where finding this balance is difficult. Many people experience nature reserves while dog walking, and some gain a wider appreciation of wildlife in the process. But without close control and guidance, dogs in the reserves can sometimes cause a significant amount of disturbance and damage. So we need to work out how to manage the dogs and their owners. Thinking about poo and those lovely trees hanging with dog poo bags, and whether you want to go to woodland and empty dog poo bins, or just encourage people quietly to take it home with them. Stick and flick can be an option in some places, but there are diseases caused by dog poo in livestock that you know those aren't removed by sticking and flicking. It's good to choose quiet cattle for sites and don't put freshly calved cows out, because they can certainly get grumpy with dog walkers. Well, any walker who goes between the cow and the calf, who may not realise that the calf is hidden in a bush. So it's better to wait a couple of, well, 6 to 8 weeks certainly before putting a cow out with her calf. It's really possible to train people on your sites with signage and communication. If a ranger's got a dog, then that is sort of a link to people coming through the woodlands with a dog. And liaise with or form friends or groups for woodlands. Holding events that attract dog owners and encouraging responsible behaviour through working closely with a few key site users can help. So these are signs for a fun day at Coedwigoedd in South Wales. So you have various novelty classes. So in North Wales, I once invited everybody to a nature reserve and said, come and learn about the nature reserve and the cattle and why it's all good, and sat there all day and nobody turned up. So the next month we said, well, come to this fun dog show. And we got about 50, 60 people. And it was a really good way to, once they were engaged and could see an agility demonstration and talk to a vet and talk to the rangers and people like RSPB and Wildlife Trust came along, and it sort of engendered really good engagement with the community. And then people start to look out and think, yes, I will take my poo home with me. And you get a very happy lady with a terrier who's won everything. Signs are an important way in which negative impacts of dogs on wildlife can be communicated to dog walkers and sort of help them understand how to eliminate or minimise their impacts. It's a good idea to engage with a local access forum on the best approach for each location of signs, and think about the words most likely to be effective. You can sort of ask people to behave responsibly. So help your dog help wildlife, or say, we have ground nesting birds, please keep your dog on a lead in this area. I think it's less effective to say dogs harm ground nesting birds. In Kenfig in South Wales, it's a local nature reserve. It's certainly a triple SI and a SAC, and it's got the fen orchid. We've got cattle out there and sheep, and there were lots of problems with dogs, but there are various places that people can take their dogs to exercise them. So we put collars on we had a project called the Digital Shepherd, put collars on the cattle, which it wasn't an electric collar to keep them in the site. It was just a location collar that sent messages to a central point, and you can log on using your mobile. You sign in and log on, and you can see where the cattle are and where the sheep are, and then you can think, well, I'll take my dog somewhere else then. And that has worked really well at just removing conflict, because I think most dog walkers don't want that conflict. It's just that if they come across a lot of sheep and they haven't realised that they were going to be there, then issues can occur. The Celtic Rainforest project, so you can have collars on livestock and use invisible fencing. So there's two sorts of invisible fencing. There's the one where you bury a cable and the livestock gets where it gets a sound, a buzz on the collar when it gets near the buried cable, and it gets an electric shock when it gets to it. And then there's another system, which is geofencing, where you actually set a line just on your phone, just draw a line, and that somehow, satellites or whatever, works to do the same, to give them a buzz on the collar when they get near the line and an electric shock when they get to it. The Welsh Government isn't funding the use of those because they're concerned about the welfare of livestock being given electric shocks. In reality, once you've trained them, not all the herd will get a shock, because the other cattle sort of explain to them, or ponies explain to them. The geofencing hasn't been approved for ponies yet. It's just for cattle, and there are some projects of getting that moving in the UK at the moment. So it's one to watch, because it's great, isn't it? You just draw a line where you don't want the livestock to go. Maybe you've replanted some trees, or you've got some regen that you don't want them to browse, or some sensitive habitat. You just draw a line around it, and they're fenced in the whole site, but they won't go to the places that you don't want them to go. So it's worth sort of thinking about that for the future. The only issue with it is that the fences around the Celtic rainforests are sometimes fencing the deer and goats out, and a geofence won't affect them at all. They'll just be able to cross that boundary, but your livestock won't. So you need to think about whether the fence is fencing things out or fencing things in. Time is on the farmer's side when you think about engaging with them, and they're quite used to sitting it out and waiting for the next ranger if they don't get on with the current one. So trust is really important. You need to try to always do what you've promised and communicate honestly with the farmer. It takes years to build up a trusting relationship, but it pays dividends. You can ask them about their farm and their system, and this will help you know what livestock could be available at different times of the year and the suitability of the livestock for conservation grazing. you need to find out how things affect them, how your management decisions might affect them. And this might help you to find out why they can or can't graze areas at the right time. It's good to do visits when you don't want anything. Sometimes it's good just to call in, have a cup of tea and see how things are going and make contact. Farmers appreciate it if you're taking an interest in their activities without making a request. And you can look for ways to work with them. There's usually things you can do to help, to encourage an action, either livestock leasing or paying for TB testing, or fencing, or help with scrub management, or providing handling pens, or helping with burning. So legislation, it's worth just having an idea of what legislation farmers are dealing with and what legislation you need to deal with if you're establishing grazing. So if you haven't used livestock before, you should check on the DEFRA website for details. If you use sheep, cattle, goats, pigs or deer on your land, then you need to register your holding with the Rural Land Registry, obtain a county parish holding number from the Rural Payments Agency and become a registered keeper if you are aiming to keep livestock. If you've got a grazier coming in, then it would be good if you got the land registered and then they would be the keeper of their livestock. If a local grazier is bringing livestock onto your land, they need to get a temporary county parish holding number, and then they would be the registered keepers. And if this all sounds like gobbledygook, there's quite good interpretation of it on the government website. Horses are not classified as livestock, so quite a few of the regulations don't apply to them, which makes them a good choice for establishing grazing on a site where you work out how the grazing will be received. Saves you a bit of trouble. So animal identification. So cattle have to have 2-ear tags, and so do sheep. They have one electronic tag and one just number that relates back. Ponies have a passport and they're microchipped when they're not on the mountain, if they're not semi-feral ponies. Cattle have a passport as well. So when you move a cow, you're given 3 days to let the cattle movement service know where you've moved it to. For sheep, you have to send in a movement form to say that they've been moved somewhere else. For ponies, they have a passport, but you just have to have that with you when you're moving them. You don't have to let anybody know where they are. TB testing, the TB regulations keep changing, so it's a good idea to check the Welsh Government website or your UK website for the most up-to-date information. There are different rules for different areas of Wales. So in some areas, cattle have to be pre-movement tested before they move to a new site. A TB test is done by injecting irradiated TB serum into the animal and measuring their reaction to it after 3 days. So you have to get the animals in twice. It's usually Monday and Thursday or Tuesday and Friday. And the vet measures the difference in the size of the reaction to the antibody, the serum. Cattle can stay on a site for 60 days from the first day of the TB test before they need to be retested to travel again. So sometimes it's sort of worth grazing the right number of cattle to manage the vegetation in 56 days to avoid having to retest them on the site that they've gone out to, because if it's inaccessible, it's hard for the vet to get out there and do the test. The complications of TB testing and movement notification can make people reluctant to graze their cattle on sites. There are arrangements that can be used, such as linking grazing sites to the main farm holding if they're within 10 miles, which can be really helpful. So it's always worth checking with Welsh Government before arranging to graze cattle on a new site. Good environmental and agricultural condition is more related to a farmer's own land, but obviously if your woodland turned into a massive bog and you had animals wading about in it, that wouldn't be good. That is a sort of a criteria for receiving single farm payment. SSI consents would affect the woodland manager, because you need to get consent if you're going to change the management, and introducing grazing to a woodland not previously grazed would definitely be a SSI consent issue. So you need to contact your local NRW people and work out whether they support the grazing, and then a derogation for that. Glass tier, you need to check that there is a glass tier agreement or not on your woodland, because that may have criteria suggesting that you can't graze or that particular management needs to be done. And the Animal Welfare Act 2006 is very important in terms of the welfare of the livestock while they're out on site. It's a duty on owners and keepers of all vertebrate animals, not just farmed animals, but pets, horses, and contained wild animals, to promote the welfare of livestock in their care. And it's quite good. It's like a pragmatic list, principles underlying management of physical and mental welfare of the animals. It forms the basis of the welfare codes, which everyone farming is supposed to have read and understood. And it's been adopted within the RSPCA Freedom Food Scheme. And really, if you're sort of making sure that your animals have got these freedoms, then they should be pretty happy wherever they are. So there's quite a few diseases you need to be aware of with your livestock. If you've got stock checkers, so I've been teaching a stock checker training course today. And these are people, either rangers or wardens or people who regularly walk on a site. And they can be really helpful to you. Instead of the site manager having to walk the site every day and check the livestock, you need to just go around once or twice a week, or the farmer go around once or twice a week, and then the stock checkers can fill in the meantime if they're properly trained. So I've been teaching people today to recognise signs of disease so that they could report if they saw it. Liver fluke affects sheep and cattle, and it causes lesions on the liver, which can really affect the animal's health. And mild wet winters, which is what we've been having, they're really beneficial to the liver fluke. It's I was expecting that. Hang on a minute, I'll go through. Yeah, it's got an interesting life cycle where the fluke lay eggs from the bile duct, and the eggs are cast out in the animal's feces, and then they hatch to release myricidia, which infect a mud snail, and then the snails release infective cercariae, which go to the vegetation and create a cyst, and then the cattle and sheep eat the cysts, and then the fluke goes through to the liver. And there's also a sort of a reservoir of wildlife hosts, like deer. The symptoms of liver fluke include a swollen lower jaw, it's called bottle jaw, and general unthriftiness. And you can treat the animals using a fluke drench. But you need to recognise it and deal with it, because it can cause them to lose a lot of condition. So other diseases, red water is carried by ticks, which might be a problem on wet or brackeny ground. They actually literally pass red water. The urine is red because of the hemoglobin has been attacked by the organism. You need to treat red water with something that has a withdrawal period, so you can't sell your livestock for 270 days after treating them with the drug. But if you don't treat them, chances are they'll die. Will certainly be quite poorly. Neosporosis is carried by dogs and foxes, and grazing around infected feces can cause abortion or stillbirth in cattle and ponies. And once infected, you pretty much got to cull or finish the animal for meat, because there isn't a cure. So sites where there's a lot of use by dogs can be grazed with male cattle and ponies so that they don't get infected, and obviously encourage dog owners to pick up. Worms are more of a problem in young stock than in older livestock. They get treated sometimes with ivermectins, which are really effective at killing the worms, but livestock dung's got a huge community invertebrates, and dung insects are obviously of conservation interest in their own right, and they're an important food for lots of birds and mammals. And the ivermectins are active ingredients in a range of wormers. So after treatment, residues of the chemical, which have got the insecticidal properties, are excreted in the dung. It's highest in the first few days after treatment, but smaller levels can be found several weeks after treatment. And exposure to these can either kill the adult insects in the dung or their larvae, or it stops the adults reproducing. So dung insect populations are dependent on the dung being available to colonize. So you've got to make sure that dung from grazing livestock is available at the times of year most appropriate to the species, and maximize the amount of ivermectin-free dung. So usually if I'm doing a grazing agreement for someone to bring their livestock onto a site, I'll say that they're not to be treated with ivermectins in the sort of month before they come on site. And the best time, if people really must use them, is to get them to use them when they house their livestock, because then it will have lost its potency by the time that dung is spread, and it won't affect the insects in the dung. If they've really got to treat something, if their sheep have got scab and they can only inject with ivermectin, then it's hard with scab, isn't it? Because you need to do everything at once. But maybe if you can sequentially treat the livestock, say if they did a third of the herd or flock at any one time. But basically it's best to keep ivermectins out of the way on conservation grazed land. So plants that cause illness in livestock include rhododendron, hemlock waterdropwort, yew, acorns, sycamore, and ragwort. And it's important to visit the site with the grazier to make them aware of what's growing in the area so they can manage their animals to avoid problems. Taking ponies off a site before sycamore sheds its seeds and before acorns fall avoids them being poisoned by those things. So it's only a short length of time while sycamore seeds are poisonous. If vegetation is short, then animals are much more likely to eat poisonous plants. So you have to take them off if you know you've got those plants around, take them off before they get hungry. And also frosty weather, or if plants have wilted and died, then that makes them more palatable. So you see fields with horses in, full of ragwort, and the horses are ignoring it. But if it gets cut, then they might eat it. Photosensitive plants, like eating St. John's wort, can cause sunburn because it sort of cooks from the inside. So monitoring is really important before you start grazing and ongoing through the grazing period. In the Celtic Rainforest, baselines have been established through pre-project monitoring of birds, common standards monitoring and lower plants, and fixed point photo monitoring has been carried out, although there was a break in that during the lockdown. This is done seasonally in the summer and winter, or before and after grazing, to capture the immediate impact. It's an easy way for non-ecologists to get an impression of the effect livestock are having on woodland structure and plants in the understory. The detailed monitoring will be carried out again at the end of the 7-year project. There's no point wasting time capturing data that won't be used, and it's really good to use specialists such as plant life lichenologists, as shown here in a rare sighting. In the meantime, the project staff, who are very familiar with their sites and experienced in recognising changes, regularly walk through the woodlands, checking availability of forage for the livestock, soil damage, poaching, and animal behaviour. Cattle will bellow if they're feeling deprived of food or water, and any health problems can be spotted. A quick and dirty monitoring system for non-specialists is to assess structural cover within a 50-metre radius of a fixed point. Record a quadrat to assess bare ground cover and density of mosses, ferns, flowering plants, taller vegetation, shrubs, trees and dung, and take a 360-degree photo. Results from this method will show changes in the woodland structure and diversity to people less experienced than Dave here looking at his lichens. And this is where the balancing act comes in. It's really important to be flexible. Every year is different, so you have to expect change and adapt. Changes may need to be made during the course of the season to try and achieve the desired outcome through grazing. Oh, there we are. So we're back to the decision tree that we had in the last presentation, because it's really good having done a spell of grazing, or to go into a wood before you start to make any changes, to check whether you agree with your initial assessment. Is the woodland overgrazed? Are there ringbark trees, lack of undergrowth, no regeneration, reduced flowering plants? or are there loads of saplings and bramble and ivy and the footpaths are overgrown? And depending on that, then you can check your constraints. So what's the welfare like for animals? Have they got water? Have you done a risk assessment? Are you having stock checking? Are the boundaries still secure? How's livestock access and handling and public access? So it's just worth going through everything every so often, and particularly after a grazing period or before the next grazing period, just to see whether you agree with your initial assessment. And if the woodland appears to be overgrazed, you need to find out the reason. Is it stray sheep and wild goats? Check the boundaries, whether they're getting in. Or is it your established livestock grazing? Do you need to make changes in your agreement with that? So you've got the option of reverting to pulse grazing after a break, or negotiating with the grazier to change the grazing plan. So we've had a quick whiz through the more practical side of grazing in Celtic rainforests, looking at livestock suitability and sourcing, provision of infrastructure, legislation, disease, dogs, management and monitoring. So I hope you find that useful. Thanks very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr. I'm happy to answer any questions now, so please ask in Welsh or English. And if anyone needs any other support, please contact the Celtic Rainforest team.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Hilary. Thank you very much. Yeah, really informative presentation once again, building on that which you gave us last week. So I'd like to open the floor up now really to the attendees or some of the panelists if they've got any questions. You can either ask them verbally or put them in the question and answers section at the bottom. Gwch chi unrhyw gwestiwn na, gewch chi yn Gymraeg neu Saesneg, unai trwy unmutio'ch hunan a gofyn cwestiwn neu trwy deipio yn y Q&A tab ar y gwylod. Okay, well, I've got a question for you, Hilary. So, is grazing or grazing in woodlands, is it feasible without support payments? That is, can it be economically feasible for a farmer to graze a woodland without, you know, some kind of support payment from, well, whoever, through a project like ours or Welsh government schemes or whatever?
I think it depends how local they are. So if somebody can just open a gate from their farm and their cattle can go in there and wander about and do some good to the woodland and get some shelter and get a bit of extra forage and then return back to the farm for haylage or whatever and then go and do a bit more browsing, then that is obviously viable. If they've got to load their animals up and take them down the road 5 miles and then go and check them every day or twice a week, then it becomes less viable because cattle farming is not profitable really, and the extra work of that isn't really worth doing. So on our conservation grazed livestock, we claim the single farm payment on the land that we graze, and that pays us to do the extra work that we have to do to have them out there. But you can't do that for woodland because there isn't single farm payment on woodland. So providing handling pens and sorting out the fencing and providing stock checkers might make it worth a farmer not having his cattle on his land for a bit and giving his fields a rest. And he might feel that that was okay. But it's so hard to make money on cattle that it's a lot better if you say, well, you know, if I give you £500, will you graze my woodland? And everybody benefits. Yeah. So it's a bit more of a sweetener. But you know, somebody who's got a gate to the woodland and you can just extend his grazing, then that might be well worthwhile for them.
So I guess going back to the question we discussed last week, you know, now that Welsh Government are looking at a post-blast period agri-environment scheme, then hopefully they'll take on board the fact that, you know, you can't claim a single farm payment on woodland. We can demonstrate actually the benefits to woodland grazing, to this project and others, maybe there'll be more flexibility in future schemes.
Yeah, that would be really good if they can work that out and make it pay, then that would be fine.
Has anybody else got a question at this point? I've got another quick one then. In that case, so it seems it's apparent to me or to us or conservationists that grazing is a really useful tool for conservation purposes, and yet in woodlands, of course, and yet you see very little of it. So why do you think that is? Is it because we've lost the skills that are required to graze woodlands with livestock? Is it because there's an overcautious approach? People are worried that livestock will actually end up being detrimental to the woodlands. Is it the lack of financial incentive, or is it kind of a bit of everything?
I think people got out of the habit. It was trendy, wasn't it, for agri-environment schemes to fence off the woodland and protect it from the livestock over the last sort of 15-20 years. And then once a woodland's been fenced out, then you just sort of get used to having your animals in the field and not in the wood. It's good to have them fenced because obviously you don't want too much grazing in there. You don't want trees ring barked and your soil poached and your bluebells lost. So you do have to have sensitively managed grazing, and I think people have got out of the habit of that. So I think it's partly agri-environment schemes that have sort of destroyed it, and partly lack of confidence, really, and people not understanding that there is a balance to be had.
I guess a lot of the graziers that do get involved with projects such as ours or tend to be more hobby graziers who have probably got an interest in conservation already, rather than your sort of standard farmer. Is that right? Am I right saying
Yeah,
that?
I think that's right. If you're going, it's easy to drive around a field on your quad bike and see if there's anything stuck in the corner, and it's a lot more complicated to have a walk up through the wood and make sure there's nothing hiding in a bush or behind a tree, isn't it? If you're a bit pushed for time. So whereas, a hobby farmer or somebody interested in conservation is interested in the benefit that their livestock are giving to the habitat as well as the habitat to the livestock.
Do you find there are enough people out there with that interest, or do you struggle?
Yeah, they're out there, but if they're not really near to the wood, then you have to make it worth their while to do it.
Well, Sgyn arall unrhyw gwestiwn ar y pwynt yma?
Beth, I just sorry, Mae'r Hefyd. So Hilary, just you've covered loads of issues there regarding the logistics and the animal welfare and lots of different aspects, and all really useful, I think, for everyone to take away. Just in terms of people will have more specific questions, won't they, relating to their own sites in future, and just in terms of this project, we're planning to have more training days, hopefully face to face in the new year. But is there any other kind of good sources of support or anything that you can recommend?
I did quite a lot of reading around the subject when I was getting ready for these webinars, and there was so little information about grazing woodlands. It was nearly always assuming that they were overgrazed and that you needed to get everything out. So maybe I look at the Grazing Advice Partnership. They're bound to have information on and just livestock management and all that stuff. Even though they're not really going, they're run by the RBST now. They've still got all their stuff online, and a lot of it has been rewritten. So that's worth looking at. But I don't think the Woodland Trust has got anything about. I didn't find anything positive about grazing on the Woodland Trust website.
Yeah, it would be quite good if the attendees could maybe just give us a nod in terms of what they might find more useful from here. So in terms of sending me an email, or if you could just put in the chat now, like, you know, would it be useful to have links or something, or, you know, what else would you like from here? And to let me know if you're interested in more training around this. We are planning to do a toolkit and also to run some training days.
Yeah. Now i gael cwestiwn trwy gyn Sian Stacey ar y chat. Diolch am y sgwrs diddorol iawn. Diolch Sian. A chi awgrymu rhai llefydd penodol yn Nghymru mynd i weld y siampar da o hyn yn digwydd. Dwi'n siŵr lle yn Nghymru wyt ti, Sian. Yn sicr yn y gogledd, swn i'n awgrymu rwla fel Coed Ganllwyd, Dolmolynllyn, fferm Dolmolynllyn y Ganllwyd. Mae'n goedlan sydd perthyn i'r ymddiriedolaeth genedlaethol, a maen nhw wedi cyflwyno pori yna wan ers i 2 neu 4 mlynedd. A mae'r bendith mae'r coedlan wedi gael o'r pori yn amlwg, wedi gymharu'n glir ardaloedd sydd wedi cael eu pori a sydd heb. Felly mae hwnnw'n yr un sydd dod i'r meddwl. Mae gennym ni safleoedd RSPB hefyd ger y Fawddach, lle da ni newydd cyflwyno pori trwy'r prosiect yma, so Coed Gargell efo mynediad cyhoeddus eitha da yna. Felly, swn i'n awgrymu un o'r safleoedd yna. Os ti eisiau mwy o wybodaeth yn ynghylch lle mae'r llefydd yma yna, ti wedi cysylltu efo ni a fedrwn ni pwyntio chdi yn y right direction here. Have you got any examples of good sites, either North Wales or South Wales or Mid Wales, for conservation grazing, should somebody want to venture out, Hilary?
Well, Ganllwyd, with the Highlands Inn.
I think some of the ones that Gethin mentioned there, Coed Gargell, and they're all sites that we're planning to use, I think, in the new year for the training days, aren't they?
Yeah. There's not a lot of good examples yet, but we're going to change that.
This project will change that.
That's in 2025, Sian, and hopefully we'll have a lot more examples.
Yeah.
Just picking up on something else in the chat, Rob's put monitoring training would be good. So thank you for that. Maybe we can try and incorporate that within the training that we'll be running in the new year. Os di rhywun arall isio sôn bod yn nhw rhyw angen neu isio cyfro yn ystod y cyrsiau am y blwyddyn newydd, gadewch i ni wybod. So do let us know if there's anything else that you want to cover in those training days.
Yeah, as just to add on that, there will be 4. We've commissioned Ponds to run 4 field events for us, COVID friendly events, and obviously they will be subject to review if further lockdowns come in. But I think planning next spring, summer, is it, Anita, for those events?
Yeah, I think we were hoping end of April for the first one, were we, Hilary?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So please keep an eye out on our social media sites and our website. I'm not sure if Ponds are on social media sites, but obviously they'll be advertised on there. So hopefully see some of you there. And obviously, as Anita said, if you've got any suggestions around topics that you'd like to cover during those events, then please let us know, because obviously we want to make sure we cater for you guys. Is there any question there, Juan? Has anybody got any further questions? Otherwise, I'd just like to say thank you, diolch yn fawr unwaith eto I Hilary ac I Anita a Helen. Thanks to Hilary, Anita and Helen for arranging the 2 webinars last week and this week's, and I've certainly found them to be really useful, really informative, and I look forward to COVID safe field visits in the spring. So diolch yn fawr iawn.
Diolch.
Diolch pawb am ddod, a diolch I Hilary. Okay.